Well, first of all, I want to thank you for inviting me. My name is Evan Weiner. I have been in the radio and TV and newspaper and magazine business since 1971. And one of my former agents, Shel Bugan, lives in Chicago. Actually, two of my former agents, Kathy Taylor, also lived in the Chicago area. And this is the story of TV, as I'm telling it. And my background is local radio. In 1978, I was working at a 500-watt radio station, and we did the early days of radio. And I put that together as a talk because I would listen to 2 hours every Sunday of block radio at my radio station. I said, I'll do a talk about that. And the natural progression was television. And that was as a kid, I used to love seeing that. That meant that it was up earlier than my parents or later than my parents if the Indian head test pattern came on. And you know, we had a tough time watching TV. We really did, because if you remember the old days of TV, you have to walk up to the TV. Well, you didn't use one of these to turn on the TV, and you had to turn on the dial, and you sat down and you waited for the picture tube to warm up, and the picture tube may take 30 seconds to do so. So you're like this, and then all of a sudden it comes on, and the TV is rolling and rolling and rolling, and it's also some snow, so you have to fix the vertical hold and then go to a dial there, and get that. Oh, good, we got it to stop rolling, and then, well, we got to do the snow, and then you get the rabbit ears, and you're moving the rabbit ears around, and sometimes you got in a position like that, and somebody else was in the room with you. They said, don't move, don't move, don't move. That's a perfect picture, but I can't stay like this for a half hour. Oh, don't worry about it. I'll tell you what the show is all about. So if you want to change the channel, you have to move from your bed to the TV or from wherever you're sitting to the TV. So we put a lot of work into watching television way back when, but that's the Indian head test pattern. And I saw it, I knew that I beat my parents. I was up later than them, and I was up earlier than them. The Indian head test pattern. Back in the 1980s, my background is radio and TV, and I was working for Mutual Radio at that time. A guy by the name of Jim Gannon was part of that. He was from Chicago. But anyway, I used to cover a lot of news conferences. And one day, I'm at Gallagher's Restaurant in Manhattan. That's on 8th Avenue and 52nd Street. And Howard Cosell is at the door, and I'm there with him. And he says hello to me, and I say hello to him. And I'm still friendly with his grandsons, Justin and Colin. So I've known the Cosell family for almost 40 years. And Howard's talking, and people are coming into this restaurant, and the noise level from Howard goes from here to here to here. It's crescendoing up. And Howard says, you know, when they write the history of TV, they're going to write about the 3 C's. Cronkite, Cosell, and Cosson, and not necessarily in that order. Gave me an idea eventually to do a talk. But if you knew Howard, and if you could translate Howard talk into regular talk, this is what he was talking about. The history of TV during his time on TV, say from the 1950s through the 1980s. Walter Cronkite, most trusted man in America, CBS. Old Iron Pants. I had 2 discussions with him, neither about news. One, he was he played hockey in a beer league in Houston in the 1930s, and the other about him playing tennis and sailing. But anyway, his nickname was Old Iron Pants. And November 22nd, 1963, he becomes the most trusted man in America. Why is that? Kennedy is shot. He comes on the air. The president has been shot. Half hour later, the president is dead. Well, Cronkite stops, takes down his glasses, kind of sheds a tear, composes himself, the glasses back on, Old Iron Pants is back in the saddle. He's doing his job again. An old war correspondent, Walter Cronkite. Yes, Howard Cosell, both the most beloved and most hated man on television in the United States in 1974. And he once told me, he says, you duplicate that. I said, Howard, I couldn't. And here's Johnny. Johnny was on for 30 years, 1962 to 1992. About 20 lifetimes on TV. Started with an hour-and-a-half show every night in New York in 1962. At the end, Bette Midler was his final guest. He somehow lasted 3 decades, unheard of in late-night TV, but he did. So, Cosell, the other thing he was trying to say is that these 3 guys would never be replaced, and in a way, they have never been replaced. The beginnings of television, Pittsburgh, 1923. A guy by the name of Vladimir Kosmos Walkin invented the iconoscope, which was a tube for television transmission. He was working for Westinghouse, George Westinghouse Labs in Pittsburgh at the time. And what you will find out is that television was developed by Westinghouse, General Electric, and another guy by the name of Philo Farnsworth, who wanted to find a picture tube that would transmit a picture. And he was able to do so by 1927, the old picture tubes that you used to see in TVs. And if you hated fixing the vertical or horizontal hold, blame Farnsworth. His image, or his television image, was comprised of 60 horizontal lines. Television would continue in development in the United States and in Europe in the 1930s. The first regular electronic television service was in Germany, in Berlin, March 22nd, 1932. Used a 180-line system, was on the air for 90 minutes 3 times a week. But it wasn't developed for entertainment. It was developed for propaganda purposes. And there is Jesse Owens, the one-time track coach at the University of Chicago, I was told. And the TV was developed, at least for the Nazis, because they were going to tell their own people or show their own people Aryan supremacy during the 1936 Berlin Olympics. Of course, Owens had a lot to do with that not happening. But it was on the air 8 hours a day in Berlin and in Hamburg, but nobody bought the sets. They were too expensive, and the Nazis got out of the television business after the Olympics. It was supposed to be a medium for propaganda. They couldn't get the volume they needed to make it work, so they just abandoned the idea. The New York City World's Fair in 1939, the innovation, television. I was on Long Island, Nassau County, right outside of New York City in November of 2019 when I used to speak in person. And I put this picture up, and there was a guy who was there. He said, can I say something? I said, sure. And in fact, if you want to say anything or add anything, just put it in the box and I'll read it. And if you have a good point, you can say it too. But anyway, he's telling me, he says, I was there. I said, you're there? He said, yeah, I was there. I was 13 years old. Now, I've had people in the New York area who are of a certain age who told me that they were at that World's Fair, and they described it as a marvel, that you sat there and you watched that little thing, as you can see in the middle of the picture, and you just gawked at it. There was really not much on there, but you gawked at it, and maybe one day you too could buy one to bring home. But this guy was telling me a story. He said he's about 13 years old, which makes him now 94, 95 years old. He's about 13 years old, and somebody from RCA, it was the Pavilion of the Future, there was an RCA TV, somebody from RCA went up to his parents and they said, excuse me, can we borrow your son here for a minute? We would like to put him on TV. We would like you to watch him on TV. And they saw nothing about it, and he said they went into a back room. He was put on TV. His parents saw it. Obviously, he didn't see it. But he said, I was on TV in 1939. I said, you were famous in 1939 because you got into 400 homes in the New York area. And he kind of half laughed at that. He said, well, I don't know if I was famous, but I was on TV in 1939. 1939, the year television started, not only in New York City, but in Chicago as well. And if you did go to that 1939 World's Fair in Flushing Meadow in New York City, you would see this, or they would hand out this flyer to you, and it's from the Radio Corporation of America, or RCA. And I'm sure some of you had an RCA TV or an RCA radio. And it said what television will mean to you. And if you were in the New York area going 50 miles north, 50 West, 50 East, 50 South. You could see some of these programs, which included the Metropolitan Opera, or boxing, or an award show, or politicians talking, news show, or baseball. You would never have to leave your home again. At least that was the plan. TV started in the United States on April 30th, 1939. That is me 3 years ago up at Hyde Park, New York, at the Franklin Roosevelt Presidential Library. I had a few things I needed to talk to Roosevelt about, because I do talks in the 1936 Berlin Olympics, and I do talk on baseball, where he sends the green light letter out in 1941, which gave baseball the green light to play during World War II after the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Hey, Franklin was a really, really good host, as was Eleanor. They had books ready for us. They were a little stiff, but it was a nice day, and it was a nice atmosphere. And I did get my answer. The question, well, I had basic questions of FDR. Why did you allow the United States team to participate in the Berlin Olympics in 1936 and that legitimized the Hitler regime in Germany, and the green light letter, and also you were the first one on TV. Did you feel starstruck? Probably not. He was doing the fireside chats at that point. But April 30th, 1939, he was at the opening ceremony of the 1939 World's Fair, and he's the first president of the United States to give a speech that is broadcast on TV to the people in the pavilion, the future pavilion, and the 400 TVs that are scattered around the New York City area. May 17th, 1939, programming expanded. The first baseball game, Princeton University against Columbia, from Baker Field in Upper Manhattan. If you wanted to buy a TV at that point, well, you could. And screen sizes, that was one of the screen size, about 5 inches. 5 to 12 inches, that was average. Dumont, which was furniture piece, or was a furniture piece, 14-inch TV, 16-inch TV. The price is about $200 to $1,000 now, about $1,800 to $9,000 a TV. Now, you may be asking, what is Gus Goose? What is Gus Goose? Well, if you're not asking, I'll tell you anyway. Gus Goose, cartoon character from Disney. And on May 19th, 1939, if you were one of the 400 households that had TVs, or places that had TVs, you had a chance to watch the first cartoon. And it was a Disney cartoon. Disney gets in the ground floor of television, both in the United States and England. In England, he's showing Mickey Mouse cartoons. In the United States, he's showing Gus Goose. Gus Goose didn't really last, although Gus Goose is in Who Framed Roger Rabbit. The cartoon was called Donald's Cousin Gus. It was on Channel 1 in New York, W2XBS, later WNBC Channel 4 in New York. And somebody's got to explain to me how a goose and a duck could be cousins, because I don't understand how they could be cousins, but apparently Gus Goose was Donald's cousin. Gus was a slob. When he ate, food went all over the place. His clothes were dirty, and he just didn't cut it. He just didn't cut it. Donald, of course, went on to be Donald Duck. Gus, he's in the history books, and they dust him off every once in a while. That was the first cartoon. First Major League Baseball game seen on TV, a doubleheader between the Cincinnati Reds and the Brooklyn Dodgers, Ebbets Field in Brooklyn, New York. And when I do this talk in New York, I have to be really careful about talking about the Brooklyn Dodgers, because there are still people in New York who absolutely hate the fact that the Brooklyn Dodgers left Brooklyn after 1957 and ruined their childhoods, just absolutely ruined their childhoods, so they didn't have a team to root for anymore. So like if the Cubs ever left Chicago, but I doubt that'll ever happen. That's the cover of my football book, America's Passion. I give talks on that too. And that's a game in Pittsburgh between the Brooklyn Dodgers of the National Football League and the Pittsburgh Pirates of the National Football League. I like the referee there. He looks like he's ready to go out for golf, and Beanie Feathers, who is carrying the football. That's a little unnecessary roughness as they bring him down. But The Brooklyn Dodgers, Philadelphia Eagles game from Ebbets Field in October of 1939. First NFL game ever on TV, and that's available to about 1,000 TV sets in the New York City area. TV does come to Chicago in 1939. W9XCV was Chicago's first television station. WBKB was Chicago's first commercial station. And WBKB also has a role in the formation of cable TV in the United States in Astoria, Oregon. Talk about that in a bit. The world's largest store, Sears, WLS TV, is now Chicago's oldest continuing operational station. It's been on the air since 1940. WBBM, the Chicago station, Channel 2, it was Chicago's 6th station or 5th station to sign on. World War II comes about. Television would be over in England. 18,999 TVs manufactured by September 1st, 1939. But development of TV would continue in the United States until 1941, Pearl Harbor Day. NBC and CBS began before World War II. The war would delay television's progress. It would be a temporary delay. When the GIs returned home in 1945, television would grow quickly. So would the want for an education with the GI Bill and moving to suburbia. But 1940, the Metropolitan Opera broadcast for the first time from NBC Studios, Rockefeller Center. And color TV starts August 29th of 1940. The CBS system, Peter Carl Goldmark of CBS announced his invention of a color television system. If you like commercials, you'll like this. If you don't like commercials, you won't like it. The history of commercials on TV. Take a look at the Indian head test pattern on the right side of that picture. Well, NBC, this is a Bulova watches. This is a Bulova commercial, and that's a camera shooting into a mock-up of a test pattern. The Indian head is knocked out. Bulova is put in on the bottom there. It's NBC, it's RCA, and they're just shooting this. It's telling you to buy a Bulova watch for 14 bucks. Bulova bought some time before a Brooklyn Dodgers game between Brooklyn and the Philadelphia Phillies. That was July 1st, 1940 on WNBT, Channel 1. It was the world's first television commercial advertisement. Certainly not the last. Will never be the last, but it was the first. The announcement for Bulova watch displays a WNBT test pattern modified to look like a clock with the hand showing the time in the Bulova logo. People who have seen this talk tell me that Bulova put out a good watch. And eventually in the 1950s, it would be animated commercials. The war comes December 7th, 1941. Ray Forrest of WNBT Channel 1 in New York broadcasts a special news report concerning the Pearl Harbor attack that preempted regular programming, which was a New York Rangers hockey game. Channel 2 in New York, WCBW, broadcasts a special that evening from their Grand Central Terminal studios. The War Production Board halts all of the manufacturing of television and radio equipment April 1st, 1942. That would last literally 3.5 years, the duration of the war, and then they would resume. The Federal Communications Commission in 1940 cut television airtime from 15 hours a week to 4 hours a week. But the war is over. Television comes back, and the Army-Navy game is transmitted by cable, coaxial cable. This is coaxial cable. It's a big thing, coaxial cable, from Philadelphia to New York City. And that is the first successful coaxial cable link up between New York and Philadelphia for the Army-Navy football game. It's the war is over. And the GIs won an education, a house in the suburbs, and give me some TV. Give me some TV. That's the Jackie Gleason Show. That's a CBS advertisement in the Trade magazine. Well, why you should, your station should pick up the Jackie Gleason show, because you get to see Jackie and Joe the bartender and the poor soul and the honeymooners and Fenwick Babbitt and Reginald Van Gleason III and the loudmouth. Not quite fully networks in 1950, but because owners used to cherry pick programming. Jackie Gleason did not start out on CBS. He started out on the long forgotten Dumont network. But the Dumont network was one of the world's, it was the world's pioneer commercial television network. Beat out NBC, beat out CBS. BBC was back on, but that wasn't a commercial television network in England. It begins operations on September 15th, 1946. And by October 2nd, the first television network soap opera is on Fairway Hill, and that's on Dumont. Dumont made TVs. They made great products, really, really great products. They just were not good television programmers or television executives. In fact, when television stations were put up and you could be an owner and operator of a station, Dumont couldn't get Chicago, couldn't get Philadelphia or New York or Washington as an what is called an O&O, owned and operated station. They had affiliates that were on UHF in some places that nobody could see because the old TVs went from 2 to 13. Very few of them had UHF. They did have a UHF affiliate in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, so they had a lot of problems getting their shows going. They also had one other problem. They could not dip into the NBC network on radio or the CBS radio network to get talent. So they had to develop their own talent, and they did. Ted Mack's Original Amateur Hour began on radio in the 1930s with Major Bowes, and Frank Sinatra never did win the Original Amateur Hour with Major Bowes. He and the Hoboken Four made it, they didn't even make it to the semifinals. The Maury Amsterdam Show. Captain Video and his Video Rangers. That was one of Dumont's big hits. In fact, I've gone to 2 talks when I've been live in the venue, and there was this woman in Stamford, Connecticut said, oh, I watched Captain Video. My dad got me the helmet. I watched it with the helmet on. And another guy in New Jersey said he didn't remember where he got the helmet, but he also watched Captain Video with the helmet on. And the Arthur Murray Dance Party. Arthur Murray's still around. Before COVID, about 2.5 miles up from where I live, the Arthur Murray Dance Studio was supposed to open. They still have a sign in the window, coming soon, coming soon, coming soon, but it's not opening up anytime soon. Hopefully before 2022 for those who want to learn the dance the Arthur Murray way. And there is Ernie Kovacs, the father of improvisational comedy on TV. In fact, some of his idea skits, not particularly his skits, were used as late as 1968-69 on Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, that little quick cutaway. I always enjoyed the Nairobi Trio, even though I knew exactly what was going to happen all the time. My favorite Kovacs bit, he's a used car salesman, and he's banging on the fender, and the car goes right through the floor after he banged on the fender. Ernie Kovacs was a Dumont discovery. He wasn't on radio. He was on local TV in Philadelphia. And Dumont was looking for programming, and they thought he was really funny, and they brought him up to the network. There are some surviving shows, not from Dumont, but from ABC when he was there. And the only reason they were there is after his death, Edie Adams called ABC, said, "You have any of the shows left? I want them." And what they used to do was erase the videotapes. So she got a hold of whatever was left over. And in the old days, it was kinescope, which is basically a camera would shoot the television and you'd get a film, kinescope. And a lot of shows, including the early days of Ed Sullivan, are on kinescopes. The early days of television, the owners said, we can pick anything we want. Well, we'll choose CBS because they got Lucy, they got Jack Bain, they got Ed Sullivan. Or we'll choose NBC because we like Milton Berle, we like Sid Caesar, we like those people. Who are these people on Dumont? We don't know. And ABC, which was owned by Paramount, had very weak shows. They really didn't do all that much. There were 4 networks at the time: ABC, NBC, CBS, and Dumont. All Dumont could offer was an unknown named Jackie Gleason or Bishop Fulton J. Sheehan. But Dumont did a few things. In fact, it was the cutting edge of television, really was. Dumont had the first network news out of Washington, the Dumont Television Network, the nation's window on the world. It had the first children's show, The Small Fry Club, with Big Brother Bob Emery. That was part of its daytime schedule. It had this guy on the Cavalcade of Stars. And on the Cavalcade of Stars, this guy, Jackie Gleason, Ralph Cramden, and his wife, Audrey Meadows, Alice Cramden. It was on Dumont that Jackie Gleason first said, one of these days, Alice, one of these days, bang, zoom, to the moon. Couldn't do that today. Politically incorrect, politically sensitive. But that was his big thing. That was Jackie Gleason's big thing on that show. And of course, he was never going to hit Alice. And also, on that show, Alice was smarter than him, and he knew it. Alice was the intelligent one, and he was the schemer on that show. So it was on Dumont's Cavalcade of Stars that Ralph Cramden first threatened to send Alice to the moon. Dumont was the home first network soap opera, first network newscast in Washington. And let me get Howard Cosell in here. Howard, come in here. Howard, who was the guy who you work with on ABC Monday Night Football? Who was there? Run, get over here. Roone Arledge. Roone Arledge, who later in his life moved over to ABC, was part of the Dumont package for Saturday Night Football. He went to ABC, came up with the Wide World of Sports. He also put money into the Olympics. The Olympics would be seen on ABC. He was the brains behind Monday Night Football. They moved him over to news, and he brought Barbara Walters in to be the first woman co-host or co-newsreader of the network news with Harry Reasoner back in 1976. So Dumont had Jackie Gleason before he went to CBS, Bishop Sheehan before ABC, the original amateur hour before NBC. Dumont didn't last too long because their management didn't know what they were doing or what they had. And they just didn't have the money. Oh yeah, they were selling high quality television sets and other equipment. They were doing that. They are now remembered, if anybody remembers them, primarily as a purveyor of low budget programming, which is not necessarily a fair assessment of them because many television shows, it's all low budget. I know here in the New York area, I know a guy by the name of Sonny Fox, who's now 95 years old, and he was on the children's show Wonderama in New York for years and years and years, and he was telling me he had no budget. He just had a camera in the studio. There was no budget for anything. He got paid, and that was it. And there was no money for writers. You had to come up with everything on your own, and that's the way it was in most cities. Sullivan was a little different. Milton Berle was a little different, but most of the quality, most of the fare on TV was just that, low-budget programming. The last non-sports program on Dumont was a game show called What's the Story, although they did have some sports properties that they farmed out to other networks at the time, get some money back. The Dumont story is rather sad because there was fights over who owned this and who owned that. And what was ever shot on kinescope, if the performers on the show didn't get it and Dumont kept it, they ended up, those shows, the kinescope shows, in a warehouse in the Bronx, New York. And there were fights over who did this, who blah, blah, all kind of fights. And so a lawyer one day decided to take it on his own. I'm going to end the fights. He got a big storage truck, and he loaded whatever was in the warehouse into the truck, drove the truck from the Bronx to the East River. And they dumped all of the kinescopes, and they lost hundreds upon hundreds of hours of Dumont programming, good, bad, or indifferent. They all ended up at the bottom of the East River, probably with Jimmy Hoffa's friends at the bottom of the East River. So maybe they're watching it. This is a pioneer of television who you probably never heard of. Her name is Martha Roundtree. women back in the 1940s had a lot of juice in media. They were working in media. In fact, the BBC in 1939, it was a woman by the name of Claire Hollandsworth who passed away recently at the age of 107, who witnessed the Germans driving the tanks into Poland on September 1st, 1939, to start World War II. There was Ruthie Gruber here, who also lived about 103 years old. She lived over in Riverdale, and she was a photojournalist who took pictures of what happened at the concentration camps and actually lobbied Franklin Roosevelt to bring over 1,000 Jewish refugees who was scattered in Europe to the United States. Roosevelt didn't want to do it initially. Eventually, she prevailed. They did. They went up to a place called Oswego, New York, which is as cold as you could get in the United States, with a lot of snow right off of Lake Ontario. And they get more snow than virtually any place else in the state of New York and in the United States. And she persuaded Roosevelt to do that. There was Pauline Fredericks. So there were a lot of women out there doing the job that they were capable of doing. And that would recede in the 1950s. This Martha Roundtree, in 1943, came up with an idea. Mutual Radio, where I worked for, in the 80s, 40 years afterwards. She came up with an idea of a show where it would be Meet the Press, where Washington politicians would sit with Martha Roundtree and others and do a show on radio. That show would go to television on November 6, 1947. Martha Roundtree would host that show, which is an amazing accomplishment if you think of television or media altogether in the 1940s. It was mostly men who did news in the 1940s on radio and on TV. And she lasted a few years. She brought on a partner by the name of Lawrence Spivak. Lawrence Spivak would buy her out and go on to host Meet the Press for a long, long time. David Gregory, Chuck Todd also hosting Meet the Press. She was the first woman and only woman to ever host Meet the Press. Meet the Press is the longest running show on American television. It is more than 73 years old. She created the show and then sold off her share of the show to Lawrence Spivak. Now, here's a story for you. And this is a story of audience participation, because you're going to tell me, hopefully, what you think in the chat box. There were 44,000 televisions in use in the United States in 1947. And NBC is beginning to bring programs over from radio to put on TV. One of them would be the Texaco Star Theater, which starred Fred Allen on radio. And NBC didn't want Fred Allen on that show. Why? Because Fred Allen had a face made for radio. It's a great comic. Wasn't all that good looking, and they thought you had to be good looking to be on TV, or at least look memorable. Henny Youngman, remember the comic Henny Youngman? Take My Wife, Please? Henny Youngman. Henny Youngman, and we'll talk a bit about this in a couple seconds, your participation. Henny Youngman was a friend of mine, a friend of mine, Bob Block, who's now 93, 94 years old, formerly of Milwaukee, who lived in Reno, Nevada, or lives now in Reno, Nevada. And Bob and I became quite friendly, and we were talking about his past. Among the things in his past, he's the father of paid TV in the United States, starting in New York with the Wameco Home Theater around 1972, Channel 68, New Jersey, Channel 67 on Long Island, and you had to buy a box so you could watch a movie. It was a paid movie, and it ended up in Chicago as well. But Bob, back in the day in Milwaukee, when he was there, ran an ad agency, including his clients included Kohl's Supermarket in Milwaukee and Selig Automobiles, Bud Selig, baseball commissioner, his father. And he also owned the comedy club. And he became really tight friends with Henny Youngman and also Maury Amsterdam, but he did not like Milton Berle because Milton Berle worked blue, which meant he used dirty words in his act, so he never used them. But one day he's telling me, he says, you know, Henny died a bitter man. I said, why? He said, because Henny thought he should have been Mr. Television. 1947, Henny Youngman gets a call from his agent. NBC wants to do the Texaco Star Theater on TV. Would you be interested? But there is a proviso here. You got to listen to this. The date they want you is also the date that you're going to do the royal family show for the royal family in London, Princess Elizabeth, Queen and King. You make the decision. Hold that thought. I'm going to come back to it in a couple of minutes, but I'm going to ask you the question. You can put it in the chat box. If you're Henny Youngman and you have the opportunity to either perform before Princess Elizabeth in 1948 or do the Texaco Star Theater, 44,000 televisions in use when you get the offer in 1947, what do you do? We'll come back to that. If you want to answer it, put in the chat. If you want to perform before the royal family or try out this thing called television, and nobody really knows if television is going to work all that well or not. But if you want to put in the chat box or raise your hand and answer it, feel free. Because I know that if I was live with you, I'd be asking the question. Okay, Marion says the Texaco Star Theater. We'll talk about that in a minute or two. Jerry Stiller is my cousin. Stiller and Mira, Ben Stiller. Jerry Stiller is my cousin. And Jerry and Ann were on the Sullivan Show about 36 times. Ed Sullivan started out the Toast of the Town in 1948, becomes the Sullivan Show in the mid-1950s, and it would end in 1971. 23 years, Ed was the impresario of impresarios. He could make or break your career if you were a singer or if you were a comedian. He was the guy that could make or break your career. And he also, for me, the Borscht Belt was only 90 miles away back in the days of the Catskills. So he would bring in the novelty acts from the Catskill hotels, which included the plate spinners. And I love the plate spinners. And he would have the bears from the Moscow Circus as well performing on the show. If you watch the Sullivan Show, you would know that he had some quirky things that he did, like he would stretch his hand out because he wanted to see his watch, because he wanted to make sure that the acts were moving as quickly as possible so he could get the commercials in. So he would do that. He was also a ring announcer for the Golden Gloves in New York City. He worked for the New York Daily News, which was part of the Chicago Tribune Company, Colonel McCormick back in those days. And so he would be the ring announcer for boxing, and they dropped the microphone down, and he would say, in this corner is so-and-so, and that corner is so-and-so. Oh, come on, here's the winner, and all that. And you probably, if you watched him, were trying to figure out, what is this guy doing? Well, what he was doing was basically being a boxing announcer presenting an entertainment show. Jerry told me a story about being on, he and Ann were on, and Anna Marie Alberghetti was on. My wife was in summer stock with Anna Marie Alberghetti in the 1970s. And Anna Marie Alberghetti was on. Now, Sullivan, if you remember, had something for everything. The little kids at the beginning of the show, and started at 7 o'clock in Chicago, 8 o'clock here in New York. So as a little kid, I could watch beginning of that show. And he had something for the teenagers, whether it was Elvis, the Beatles, or others. And then he'd have some for young adults who got their kids down, and then the empty nesters, and then the senior citizens. The empty nesters, probably a Broadway show performer, because Broadway was dark on Sunday nights. So he brings Anna Marie Alberghetti on, or he books Anna Marie Alberghetti on, and she sings some song from whatever show she was on in Broadway. And Ed, come on, take a bow. Take a bow, doing the ring announcer thing, take a bow. And he's very upset because he doesn't think the audience is giving Anna Marie Alberghetti the kind of due that he thinks she should get. So he says, come on, let's hear it for Ave Maria. Well, if I was there in person, you'd be laughing at it. But Jerry said he was quirky, but Jerry and Ann were on 36 times, and he helped their careers immensely. He gave them a lot of advice, too. Don't do that, don't do this, don't do that. He kind of sometimes rewrote their act. Let's go back to the Texaco Star Theater. Okay, so we have in our chat box here, Mary Ann saying that the Texaco Star Theater. Okay, so Henny Youngman, if you don't know, was born in Liverpool, England, as were the Beatles. And so his agent says, well, what are we going to do? The royal performance may be the only time you get to do it. Television, we don't know anything about. It may last, it may not last. Well, he makes his decision, and the decision is this. I'm going to do the royal performance. So he does the royal performance, and the guy they pick is this guy, Milton Berle. Uncle Milty, must-see TV, Tuesday nights, 8 o'clock. I have a friend from the New York area by the name of Larry Strickler, who now lives down in the Boca Raton, Boynton Beach, Florida area. And I used to speak up at the Borscht Belt at Kutcher's, and Larry was kind of the counselor during the heyday, well, after the heyday of the Catskill hotels, but it was at the Pines, Brickman, and Kutcher's Hotel. And we got to talking one day about him being a child actor on the Milton Berle show. And I said, he didn't know the story about Henny Youngman. And I told him the story. He said they picked the right guy with Milton. He said Milton could do a lot of things, very difficult to work with because he was a perfectionist. But being a perfectionist, he made that show work. He said Henny was, one-trick pony. He was a comic with a lot of one-liners, fast, glib guy, but he couldn't do what Milton Berle did. Milton Berle was perfect for the Texaco Star Theater. Henny was perfect for doing whatever he was doing, which was a stand-up comedy routine, which included Take My Wife, Please. Berle sold televisions. Henny was not going to sell televisions. The Texaco Star Theater was credited with driving the sales of television from 500,000 when Berle started in 1948 on the show to 30 million when the show ended. And he produced results. His show was the #1 rated show, 1950-51 season, the first year that Nielsen's ratings were used. And he got a lifetime contract from NBC. I got to meet him once. It was in 1986, and I was up at NBC, 1700 Broadway in New York, and we kind of merged Mutual NBC at that point. So I was up in the studios, and Milton walks in, and I had heard Milton was really crude to a lot of people. I can't say that. He was a perfect gentleman with me. And I said, what are you here for? And he said, we're doing the 60th anniversary of NBC, and I'm listening, and I'm going to watch old tapes today to see what should be used and what shouldn't be used, and give them some historical background on it. So he was very nice to me. I heard Milton could be very, very difficult, but I didn't have that experience. In 1950, Ed Sullivan got some competition from NBC, and back in the early 1950s, Chicago was kind of a hub for television. Chicago, New York, LA. Most of the shows were in New York, and the rest were in LA. And the competition, the Colgate Comedy Hour, and Abbott and Costello, they were the Chicago hosts. Martin and Lewis, they were the hosts in Los Angeles, and Eddie Cantor was the host in New York. And you might have heard the name Joe Franklin if you watch Saturday Night Live. He was a local legendary guy in New York. Joe Franklin, Martin Paint, all that. And I got to know him and Richie Ornstein. But his favorite performer was that guy, Eddie Cantor, and Making Whoopee. And he was the host in New York. And he didn't do all that well. And the reason why he didn't do all that well was he's a big star in the 20s and 30s. And by the 50s, he was old. He was old. Martin and Lewis were at their height in the early 1950s, and they were the only serious competition for Ed Sullivan as far as ratings. They're part of the show from Los Angeles, and from Chicago, Abbott and Costello. At that point, they are totally overexposed. They have another show on, the movies, and who's on first, all that other stuff. They're thoroughly overexposed, and there wasn't that much interest in them. But I was at Teaneck, New Jersey, and there was a senior home, Teaneck, New Jersey, one day, talking about that particular show. And there was an old engineer from television who decided to give me the history behind that show and why it was an important show in television history, even though it didn't last. And again, coaxial cable here. It was the first show that New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles were all weaved together within the time slot. There were 3 production units that were set up in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. And because of this and the microwave connection, that show was able to be put on, and it proved that you could match up a show in Los Angeles or Chicago or in Los Angeles, have it as one coherent show. Show had talent on, a lot of talent on, but eventually, in the end, Ed Sullivan would beat them. There is the first show that was on color, the Howdy Doody Show, which was on Channel 5 in Chicago, WMAQ. Buffalo Bob Smith and Howdy Doody, they would start in 1947. Buffalo Bob Smith lived about 5 miles from where I'm sitting today in Scarsdale, New York. And you couldn't miss his house. And the reason you couldn't miss his house in Scarsdale, he always had a lot of kids around there, had a big totem pole right in the middle of the property. If you saw the totem pole, you knew whose house it was. It was Buffalo Bob Smith. Howdy Doody would start. That would be December 27th, 1947. It would last until 1960. It would be the first children's show to be on air in color. And it was a strategic move by RCA, which was NBC's parent company. They made color TVs. They wanted to sell color TVs, and they wanted to get to a market of little kids. And those little kids would nag their parents, I want TV, I want color TV, I want color TV, I want color TV. I don't know how many bought color TV from that, but I do know that something like this is not particularly, this thing here, was put over television screens to simulate color, except you never really got color. You got some offshoot of the color. But they did sell that kind of stuff. Anyway, it was on at 5 o'clock Eastern, 4 o'clock in Chicago. Bob Keeshan was Clarabelle the Clown on that show. He would leave that show and become Captain Kangaroo. A lot of people saw TV for the first time like this. They would look into an appliance store window and they'd watch TV. I really don't know where this is from. I can make some guesses though, and I think I'm right. It was probably World Series time. Baseball in October, just by the way they're dressed. And these guys are watching really intently, and there's no sound on. That gives it away. You couldn't hear the TVs outside. They were out there. They were a display. So they're watching intently. So it had to be a baseball game. It might have been a football game on Sunday, but it was, or Saturday, college football. But it was more than likely a baseball game because World Series games sold televisions. And there's a woman just walking away. And based on that car in the background, it looks like it's the late 1940s. Anyway, they're watching TV. And there's a guy in Mahoney City, Pennsylvania, by the name of John Walson. And he's got one of those appliance stores with the TV. Now, in this picture, you can see there are no mountains. But Walson is in the Alleghenies. And he has a problem. You know, I hate when this happens. Hold on. You know what happens here. You got to adjust things. You've seen this before. Hold on. Let me adjust. Okay. Hey, we're back. Anyway, so he's got this store in Mahoney City, Pennsylvania. And he's got TVs. And he wants to sell TVs. This is 1947, 1948. And he's thinking, how am I going to sell TVs? Because, you know, the reception is awful here. It's terrible. You know, I have the TVs here. They put it on, and it's all snow. It's all snow. They can't watch TV. So he gets an idea. And the idea is, why don't I go climb up one of these hills or these mountains behind my store? And I'll put an antenna up there, and I'll go to the Army Navy store, get some twine, and run the twine down from the antenna into my store. Because the mountains are blocking my store and some buildings blocking TV signals, maybe it'll work. And there is John Walson. And sure enough, 1947, he goes to the Army surplus store. He buys some heavy twin lead wires. He runs the wires and the coaxial cable, ran them down the tree from a nearby mountain to the appliance warehouse, and people go into the warehouse and they look, hey, we can watch this from Pittsburgh or Johnstown. You really watch it? He said, yeah, and I could get you TV and I could get you that picture. And with that, he sells the TVs and runs the wires down from the mountain through the trees and all, and that starts something called community antenna television, which would eventually become cable TV. Well, maybe. Maybe. Let's go to Astoria, Oregon. That is in July of 2018. I'm out in Astoria, Oregon. And Astoria, Oregon during the summer, it's 62 degrees there every day. And you get 3 hours of sunshine every day because it is at the point where the Columbia River and the Pacific Ocean meet. Town named after John Jacob Astor. So anyway, take a look at that picture. You got that yellowish building where the person with the red coat is walking with somebody else. That is the office of Ed Parson. Behind there is the Astoria Hotel, and behind there is the tallest building in Astoria. And that too is part of the history of cable television. Ed Parsons, 1948. He is listening to his wife for 2 years say, I want TV, I want TV, I want TV, I want TV. Ed Parsons does have a TV in his house, buys one. In the event there's television coming to Astoria, Oregon. Probably not with the population of 10,000. So Grace Parson wants to watch TV, and Ed gets word that it's a new TV station started up in Seattle, KRSC. Now, let me see if the signal comes down to Astoria, which is about 90 miles away. He owns a radio station in town, so he knows how to play around with signals. 2 years earlier, Ed Parsons is in Chicago. He's attending a radio convention, and his wife, Grace, is with him, and it was BKB, and they're looking, Channel 2, now WBBM, and they're looking at this TV. Grace decides, I want TV, I want TV, I want TV. Ed decides, we're gonna do an experiment, get some coaxial cable, right? And goes to puts an antenna up on that building that you saw behind his office, runs the coaxial cable from the antenna on top of the building, because he knows he could get the signal up there, because he played around, got an extension cord, put the TV up there, so he knew he could do that, but can he run the signal from the roof to his office? He does. He calls Grace. Grace is happy as can be. She's got TV out of Seattle. Okay, but the problem is, I don't want to stay at your office. Can we run it to our house? He says, let's try it. Moves the TV to the house. Yeah, it's got a signal. Grace decides to tell all of her friends, we got TV. Poor Ed. He lost. He was the king of his castle. No more, not anymore. Loses his living room, loses his kitchen. More importantly, loses his bathroom. So he's got to figure out something. Gets another TV. And he tries to figure out if he could use 2 coaxial cables, split the signal. He does. It works. Everybody's gathered at the house. And Ed says, go out and buy TVs. I guarantee you, for $3 a month, you can watch the same thing, because I will wire up your house. And he did. He got $3 a month for a long time for wiring up people's houses after they got TV. And because he owned a radio station, he never told the FCC about his dastardly deed of stealing a signal out of Seattle. Problem solved. Ed's got his bathroom back, and his living room, and his dining room, and his kitchen, and he's the most popular guy in town because he is providing television. And that is how cable TV started, both on the East Coast and the West Coast. May 3rd, 1948, CBS Television News starts, second longest TV show in American history. Political conventions, June 21st from Philadelphia, covered. The BBC in England begins its coverage of the 1948 Olympic Games in London, broadcasting the opening ceremony. And Lucy, explain yourself. That is Desi and Lucy, Desi Lou. 1948, the married couple decides to start a television studio called Desi Lou. It was also a movie studio. It was Howard Hughes' old RKO studio that Desi bought. And he's going to become a television producer. And what he basically did was invent the modern situation comedy in 1948. Here's a question for you. I know the answer. Here's a question. What's your 3 favorite Lucy episodes? I can tell you what they are, but I'll let you do that immediately. And when we come back to Lucy, I'll ask you about it. But I have a feeling it involves stomping grapes, and it involves candy and vitamins, among other things, a conveyor belt. Anyway, so 1948, they start this, and they said, we want to do a TV show called I Love Lucy. They pitched William Paley as the head of CBS and say, want to do this TV show. Paley had Lucy as a radio performer. Yeah, sure, this sounds great. We'll do it. Oh, by the way, Desi's going to be my husband. What do you mean Desi's going to be your husband? He's going to be my husband in the show. No, he can't be. Well, what do you mean he can't be? We can't have a Cuban man married to the all-American girl like you, Lucy. It's got to be somebody else. And they said, well, if it has to be somebody else, we're not doing the show. Eventually, Paley says, okay. And it's a gold mine. And it also puts Lucy into a position where she would become the most powerful woman on TV in 1964, 65, 66, through a series of things that happened. The I Love Lucy show starts in 1951. And the three things are the candy store, the conveyor belt, the vitamins, and also the great stomping. And number 4 is when little Ricky is born. Waukegan's own Jack Benny moves from radio to television in 1950. I love the Jack Benny show on radio. It's the greatest show ever on radio for comedy. Biggest laughs. It's just great. Moves to TV, in my opinion. It's slow. It is too slow, and it's too predictable. Radio, it wasn't. Also, Benny's 56 years old in 1950 when it moves to TV. And it's the jokes are ridiculous about the blue eyes and the walk and being 39 years old. The miser thing still works out, but some of the others, perfect on radio. Here's the difference, radio and TV. Radio, you have to imagine things. It's the theater of the imagination. TV, to watch it, take your eyes off it, come back, and you don't lose too much. Radio, you had to concentrate on. I learned that at the 500-watt radio station when we had the Sunday block. You Bet Your Life started out on radio, Groucho, which is the TV show, is a vehicle for his wit. And to his right there, to your left, is Fenneman, George Fenneman, the greatest straight man ever in comedy game shows. Fenneman was the foil. There's a story that probably happened on radio, didn't happen on TV, that might have happened, might not have happened. It's either an urban myth or it really happened. There's no tape that says it existed, but people said it existed from the radio show. Fenneman used to say, Groucho, let's meet our next contestants. Groucho Marx, meet Marion and Charles Story, a married couple. They have 20 children. Mr. and Mrs. Story, meet Groucho Marx, Mr. and Mrs. Story. Groucho looks at Charlotte Story and says, oh, well, why'd you choose to raise such a large family? And Charlotte Story is said to have replied, I love my husband, to which Marx replies, Groucho replies, I love my cigar, but take it out of my mouth every once in a while. He's doing a talk at a senior place in Tarrytown, New York, and there's this married couple sitting right in front of me, and I see her go like that to her husband. What does he mean by that? What's he mean by that? And I said, I'll explain it after everybody leaves. And the husband said, no, I'll explain it to her. It's going to take a while to explain to her. And that generally gets my biggest laugh of all. I Love Lucy, of course, was a big time show. The night shows, the late night shows, Broadway Open House. Sigourney Weaver's father, Pat Weaver, who was an advertising executive, came up with the idea. Jerry Lester, Maury Amsterdam were the original host. Maury left the show. He left Jerry Lester to host, and there was a woman singer by the name of Jenny Lewis, or Dagmar, on the show. Dagmar. I was in Glen Cove, New York, and talking to a seniors group, and there's this guy about 90 years old, and he starts breathing heavily all of a sudden. He's, and I'm looking at him and saying, "You okay? You need help?" No. I said, "Well, what's wrong?" And he says, "Dagmar, the best breather on TV." Huh? And then there was another guy out in Nassau County, New York. He was in his 90s. And he's going like that. And I said, "What?" He said, "Dagmar, that. I said, "You ought to be ashamed of yourself. How old are you? 93? Does your granddaughter know that you're, Dagmar. Jenny Lewis had, like Kim Kardashian, two major assets, as you could see there. That was her selling point. She went from about $125 a week to $1,250 a week. The biggest paid star on television all of a sudden overnight was Dagmar. And almost overnight, she was the least popular star. The show was canceled. She went back on the nightclub circuit, but she was never forgotten. See, the engineers over at General Motors decided that they were going to do some tweaks on the Coupe de Ville and some of their other cars. And how are they going to do their tweaks? Oh, we know. We're going to put those nose cones on the bumpers. We're going to put them on both the front and back bumpers, as in you could see in this Coupe de Ville. And we're going to call them the Dagmar bumpers. And car enthusiasts, car historians, to this day, most people have no idea who Dagmar was, but car enthusiasts do, because of the Dagmar bumpers, which that guy in Long Island was trying to tell me going like that. Bum, 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 bum. Story about sea is true. The names have been changed to protect the innocent. Dragnet started in 1951, lasted 8 years. It was enduring. Second version, 67 to 70. That was in color. There was supposed to be a third version in the 1980s, but Jack Webb died of a heart attack. So there was no third version. And high ratings, the recognizable theme song, the badge, the LAPD badge 714, and Sergeant Joe Friday. Just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. Dave Garroway hosted the Today Show, so did J. Fred Muggs, who is the mascot of the show. Garroway hated J. Fred Muggs, who's still alive and lives down in Tampa, lives the life of a distinguished chimpanzee in some area in Tampa right now, some preserve. It was a Pat Weaver show, and it has not changed in 69 years. Today, blended national news headlines, interviews with newsmakers, lifestyle features, other light news and gimmicks, and local news updates from NBC network stations. I think it's on for 4 hours a day on Channel 5 in Chicago. Steve Allen Show, that was popular at night. It featured Don Knotts. Before it was Barney Fife in a very similar character. Louis Nye in a smug character that he reprised on the Beverly Hillbillies. Tom Poston, who did not reprise his role on any other show. The Man in the Street featured Don Knotts as the nervous Mr. Morrison. Tom Poston was a man who could not remember his own name. Pat Harrington as an Italian golf player. Guido Panizzi. Louis Nye as the smug Gordon Hathaway. And Bill Dana. My name is Jose Jimenez, Bill Dana, who was a very popular guy among the Mercury and Gemini astronauts because he put Jose Jimenez in space. And a friend by the name of Shelley Saltman, who grew up with Leroy Neiman in Boston, and Bill Dana, actually Dana's brother, who ended up being a doctor. Anyway, he told me Bill Dana retired the Jose Jimenez character in the early 1970s because he felt that it was politically incorrect, Bill Dana. Elvis was on the Steve Allen Show. There he is, all dressed up in a tux with tails. singing "Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog" to a basset hound. Elvis really didn't like doing this, but he was a young guy before his hair was dyed jet black. Liberace told him to do that. And he was on the show because the Colonel felt he needed some additional publicity, so he sung Hound Dog. Jack Parr took over from Steve Allen, and he had a run-in with NBC censors because he did a joke about the WC from his trip to Europe. And the WC, of course, in Europe is short for water closet, and you couldn't say bathroom on the air. If you were a married couple like Lucy and Desi, you couldn't sleep together in the same bed. If you were a couple and you were in the bedroom, if you were in the scene, one foot had to be on the floor, one foot had to be on the bed. Mary Tyler Moore refused to wear a skirt because she felt in the Dick Van Dyke Show, because she felt it was silly to vacuum with a skirt on when she could wear capri pants. Carl Reiner went to the mat with CBS, and they allowed Mary Tyler Moore to wear pants. 1960. Strange rules on television, really strange rules. Not really rules, they were unwritten rules because I guess somebody didn't want to offend anybody's sensibility. There was a woman in Northvale, New Jersey that told me that her brother was one of the dancers on American Bandstand when the show was in Philadelphia. She said, yeah, my brother used to get picked up and in a limousine, and he would go and be one of the dancers, and I'd have to wait online to get inside, but they would let me inside because my brother was one of the dancers. American Bandstand started out in Philadelphia on WFIL TV, called Bandstand, and it was a Bandstand Glenn Miller type show, and eventually it would pivot over to a rock and roll show starring Dick Clark by 1956, with teenagers dancing to popular records. At this point, the Dumont TV network is out of business. ABC and NBC have the market share, but ABC is looking, Paramount that owns ABC is looking to expand its market share. It has 14 stations, that's all it has, and NBC and CBS have over 70. So they go around and they start talking to their affiliates, and they say, hey, do you got anything that we could use on the network? And the people at WFIL said, we got this young guy named Dick Clark, and these teenagers just dancing, and it was a low-budget show. It was a really low-budget show. When you talk about Dumont being low-budget, this was low-budget back then, the local show, Philadelphia. And they said to ABC, yeah, you know, we got this thing called Bandstand, and the rest is history. 1957, it goes on to the American Broadcasting Company, or ABC. Again, it happened again. It keeps happening. Oh, here's my wife, 1982. We're at Disneyland, Magic Kingdom, all that other stuff. What's this got to do with anything? Has something to do with a lot. See, Walt Disney back in the mid-1950s decided he wanted to expand his empire from just animated films and the children's films. He wanted to do something else. He was going to build an amusement park, and his deal was, let's build an amusement park. We'll go down to the orange groves in Anaheim, which used to be a butt of a joke during the Jack Benny show. Anaheim, Azusa, and Cucamonga, the train conductor skit. Anyway, so he's looking around for money, and he can't find any money in Los Angeles because he doesn't have the money to build an amusement park. And if you remember back in the days of the 1950s and 60s, amusement parks popped up everywhere, along with drive-in movies. And I know I grew up in Queens, New York, and within 4 miles of my house, there were separate little amusement parks. And up here where I live in Westchester, there was Ride Playland, which was the first planned amusement park. But there were amusement parks all over the place. Coney Island in New York, and I'm sure in the Chicago area, you had your share of amusement parks. So the idea of an amusement park in the 1950s was no big deal, even if it was Walt Disney trying to pitch it. So he's going from place to place to place to place, and finally he goes to Paramount that owns ABC, and they're looking at the numbers. CBS has 54 stations. NBC has 14. Rather 71. We have 14. We could do a deal here. Let's see. We'll roll the dice. We'll put up some money. You can build this park in Anaheim, but you got to do a couple things for us. We want 2 shows. Want two shows. We want one from Disneyland, and we want one other. And if I was live with you, I would ask you what the other one was, and 85% of you would have the right answer. There was Disney, the mouth that roared. It was the Mickey Mouse Club. And the Mickey Mouse Club would make ABC profitable. Then I would ask you the next question. Name all the Mouseketeers. Forget Annette. Name the others. I had only one person, one woman, ever successfully name all of the Mouseketeers, including Tommy and Tuppy. Anyway, with the money, ABC would eventually go out to Warner Brothers, buy Westerns, and would go to Desilu, owned by Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball, and buy detective series like this one, The Untouchables, based on what happened in Chicago in the 1930s during Prohibition, with Robert Stack as Elliot Ness and Bruce Gordon as Frank Nitti. I once hung out with Robert Stack one night. His personality was that of Elliot Ness. He was nice. Just didn't have much to say. We were at the baseball game together and all of that. He was promoting something in New York. Anyway, it was a great show. It was one of the highest rated shows until one day somebody from the Italian Defamation Association gave Desi a call and said, yo, not every Italian is crooked like you have on the show. Maybe you should use some different names. And he anglicized the names. And when he anglicized the names, something weird happened. People didn't watch it anymore. And with 2 years, the show was canceled. Rod Serling hosted Twilight Zone. He used storytelling to explore the human condition and culture of his time, 59 to 64. WMAQ, Channel 5 in Chicago, 1956, became the first television station, world's first all-color TV station. Not everything was in color, but shows like Frank Kukla and Allen were in color. They flipped the switch in Chicago. 110 NBC affiliates showed some color episodes of some shows that day, and it all starts in Chicago in 1956. The Bozo Show. The Bozo Show was on from 1961 on into the 80s on WGN Channel 9 in Chicago. That was the Bob Bell Bozo Show. Bozo originated in Los Angeles when Ellen Livingston created the clown for Capitol Records for children's albums. Channel 11, KTTV in LA, aired the first Bozo program in 1949. Larry Harmon, who was one of the first Bozos, purchased the rights to the franchise in 1956. The Bozo in Chicago, Bozo Circus, appeared on WGN in 1961. I probably did see Bob Bell as a clown because Bob Bell's show was syndicated. I'm sure some of you might have watched Bob Bell as the clown. It broadcast every weekday afternoon at noon. As we come toward the end here, people ask me all the time what I think is the funniest show ever on TV. From what I have seen from the old clips, it is this show, your show of shows. And maybe the funniest clip I have ever seen of any television show is when Sid Caesar and Howard Morris do the Uncle Goopy skit, which is based on the Ralph Edwards show, This Is Your Life. It is hysteric. You go up there, look for Uncle Goopy or Sid Caesar and Howard Morris, Uncle. You will have 11 minutes of pure comedy gold. That is the gold standard from the mid-1950s. Now, what made this show so good? I don't know. I don't think he could do this show anymore, simply because there's not enough money to do this show. That's Imogene Coca with Sid Caesar. Yeah. Where are you going to get the money to pay these guys? Well, I don't know about Mel Brooks. I've never heard of that guy. Mel Brooks, Melvin Kaminsky. I think he did the producers after that. Blazing Saddles. That's what somebody told me. Neil Simon, he did The Odd Couple, Barefoot in the Park, Biloxi Blues. Danny Simon was a television writer. Mel Tonkin did some All in the Family. Lucille Kalin did, she was on TV and she did a lot of writing. Selma Diamond, when I was a kid, was always on TV. I don't know what exactly she did, but she was on talk shows. Joseph Stein, Michael Stewart, they did the Bilko show. They did Car 54, Where Are You? Tony Webster. Carl Reiner, who just passed away, came up with the 2,000-Year-Old Man with Mel Brooks. Carl was a regular on that show. And then Larry Gelbart, who ended up doing MASH, came on staff along with this guy, Woody Allen. You couldn't pay these people enough to be on these shows anymore, or this particular show. But Carl Reiner, I was watching one of his things with Mel Brooks, which is always on PBS, and I always get upset watching it because the host, whoever it is, should just shut up because there's nothing to ask. You just say that Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks, go. You don't bother you don't interrupt, just go, let them do it. Because you're just in the way of Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks. But Carl Reiner once said, we're all young ones. We started somewhere. They happen to start here. And there's a book called Laughter on the 23rd Floor, all about that show, which has probably had the best writers of all time and the funniest skits, among the funniest skits ever on television. Nat King Cole was on that show. You show shows every once in a while. Nat King Cole was the Jackie Robinson of television, but he really wasn't. Nat King Cole was not the first African-American to host a television program, but he never got a sponsor. The pianist and singer Hazel Scott, she was from the English territory of Jamaica, moved here, went to Juilliard. She had a show on Dumont. Remember, Dumont was looking for talent, 15 minutes every week, Monday night. And Billy Daniels, they had shows in the 1950s. Nat King Cole's show would start in 1956, and it was disgraceful. He had no sponsors. Rheingold Beer and was the sponsor, local sponsor in Hartford, New York City, Coca-Cola in Houston, Regal Beer in New Orleans, Gallo Wine and Colgate Toothpaste in Los Angeles. In Chicago, he did not have a sponsor. NBC decided for 1 year we could have him on the air, pay him. But there was a problem. There was no money going into the show, so he couldn't pay for guests. He had his friends come on, but you can only ask your friends to come on every once in a while without paying them, and that became a problem. On December 17th, 1957, the party's over. Nat King Cole's last show. Go up to YouTube. There are clips from those shows. They're hilarious. They are good. You want to see a pro's pro? Watch the Nat King Cole clips up on YouTube. He performs The Party's Over, which you can see on YouTube, accompanied by a montage of photographs featuring Cole and some of the guests who were on the show, including Frankie and Ella and Harry Belafonte and Sammy and Frankie Lane. And Frankie Lane made history on that show. The original show, Cole was supposed to only have African-American performers. And he said, no, we can't do this. These are my friends. And Frankie Lane desegregates the Nat King Cole show and go up on YouTube, and they are having such a good time goofing on one another as they're singing, Frankie Lane. Nat pulled the plug on the show. He was told you could have Saturday night at 7 o'clock. Nat said, no, I'm going to go on my way. The Singer Sewing Machine Company wanted Nat's Tuesday night time slot. They wanted to put a Western on, named The Californians. Nat declined the Saturday show, and then when he was asked about what happened, he said, we're close to getting a sponsor, but I found out this. Madison Avenue was afraid of the dark. Hazel Scott was on TV in 1950 on the Dumont Television Network. On June 22nd, her name appeared in Red Channels. She was a communist. Now, Red Channels Hollywood Reporter started, quote unquote, ratting out communists without any proof. In 1948, Hollywood Reporter just recently apologized for unsourced material, just throwing it into their magazine and ruining many, many careers. Scott decided she was from the British territory, Jamaica, but she lived in New York. She was married to Adam Clayton Powell III, who was a congressman eventually. She appears before the House on Un-American Activities Committee, September 22nd, 1950, said, I'm not a communist. All the sponsors pulled out, and a week later, Dumont pulled the series as well. TV had more diversity in the early days. They had the Beulah Show on ABC. It makes the jump over from CBS radio to TV. There were 4 Beulahs, the Queen of the Kitchen, 2 of them, Ethel Waters, Hattie McDaniel. But ABC only had 14 stations, and it just lasted 2 years. Amos and Andy, that started on WGN radio in Chicago in 1927, makes the leap to TV by 1951. There are some differences. African-American actors play Amos and Andy and Kingfish and everybody else that were on the show. June 1951 it starts. It ends in April 1953. 52 episodes. It is watched. It is heavily watched. Sponsored by Black's Brewing Company. This television series used black actors, but the NAACP didn't like it. They didn't like Amos and Andy. Didn't like Kingfish or all the other characters. Yet there were African American actors on the show. They pulled it because of this protest. They couldn't get a sponsor. Amos and Andy on CBS, number 13 in the ratings in 51-52, 25 in 52-53. But Blatz was afraid of the boycott by the NAACP, pulled its support, and that was the end. And it put African-American actors out of business. Some of the women on TV: See the USA, Drive a Chevrolet, that is, or In Your Chevrolet, Dinah Shore. Betty White. Betty White was on NBC with a morning show. Got in trouble with that morning show. Our Miss Brooks, Eve Arden. Why Miss Brooks Can't Get Her Man. My Little Margie, starring Gail Storm. Loretta Young coming out in her gowns and all that, introducing the Loretta Young show. And when it went into syndication, you never saw Loretta Young because she didn't want to look old and frumpy in those old gowns 10 years later. And Southern Executive Secretary. The Donna Reed Show with Donna Reed. Donna is the first woman who is the central character of the show. The husband was not the central character. The first woman who ran a business on the show was Kate Bradley on Petticoat Junction, B. Benedette. And she was the proprietor of the Shady Rest Hotel. She is the first woman shown actually working on a television show, and that takes until 1963. And Spring Byington on December Bride. The first show with a woman, yo-ho, Mrs. Goldberg. And there is Gertrude Berg and Philip Loeb. They make the jump from radio to TV in 1949. First situational comedy. Gertrude Berg created the show. She played Molly Goldberg. Situation comedy. The show was killed because Philip Loeb was outed by Red Channels as a communist, or accused of being a communist. And if you read Zero Mostel's letters, he was very upset about this with Philip Loeb, and the whole deal with the blacklisting, because Zero Mostel was also blacklisted. Philip Loeb would commit suicide because he was blacklisted, and Zero Mostel was very, very upset about that. Without Philip Loeb on the show, and Gertrude Berg was told, we want the show to continue, but you got to get rid of him, and she eventually capitulated to NBC or Dumont, and the show continued, but the show wasn't interesting without Loeb. I remember Mama was about a Norwegian family. There was a show about an Italian family. The early days of TV had ethnic shows, but that would change rather soon. This is Arthur Duncan. He was on the Lawrence Welk Show between 1964 and 1972. He was also on the Betty White Show in 1954. And Betty gets called down to the office and says, hey, we love your show. We love you. Everything's great except for one thing. Why is this guy Arthur Duncan on the show? Some of the station managers don't like him. They don't think he's good. The sponsors don't think he's good. Well, Betty White said, no, he's staying on the show. She knew why they wanted to get rid of him. He's staying on the show. And if you force me to get rid of him, you forced me to quit the show as well. They got rid of Arthur Duncan. Betty White quit. She took a stand for Arthur Duncan. She could have ruined her career. But, she went on to game show after game show after that. But Betty White stood up for Arthur Duncan. You had the Westerns, that's Maverick, James Gardner there. Playhouse 90, Cowboys and Indians. Gary Moore had 3 shows on. The show for women during the afternoon. The show that was I've Got a Secret, and the Carol Burnett show. Well, it was Gary Moore show featuring Carol Burnett. Gary Moore was Jimmy Durante's sidekick and really Carol Burnett's sidekick during the Gary Moore show. Art Linkletter had that house party show during the day. People are funny. Kids say the darndest things. Soap operas, variety show. I hate this. Well, you know, hopefully we don't have any more of these. Oh, there's Maynard G. Krebs, the beatnik. He was a beatnik. He wasn't a hippie. Maynard has a goatee, wears a ripped sweatshirt, has a love of jazz, and uses the like vocabulary. It was the many lives of Dobie Gillis and depicted many elements of the counterculture or the beat culture. Maynard G. Krebs was not the prototype of the late 1960s hippie. He's like, man, you know, look, Daddy, oh, he was the best. Like, he was the best. Maynard G. Krebs. Quiz show scandals. Mr. Stemple, one of his relatives, lives down the block from me. That's Herb Stemple. Charles Van Doren, the 21 show, that was fixed. Stemple was coached by the producer, Dan Ambright, to allow his opponent, Charles Van Doren, to win the game. Stemple took the fall requested of him. A year later, he talked to the New York Journal American's Jack O'Brien and talked about how the show was choreographed. His statements gained more credibility when match fixing was found at another game, Dado, which was hosted by Jack Nars, who had no idea. That was August of 1958. The quiz show ratings across the network plummeted. Several were canceled. There was a grand jury that held hearings on the fixing. Nothing happened. Congressional subcommittee investigated all that. And Wright said, yeah, the game was rigged. So what? Who'd we hurt? We didn't hurt anybody. They agreed, and the audience liked it. It was no big deal. Congress in 1960 amended the Communications Act of 1934, prohibiting the fixing of game shows. Bart Barker, who just celebrated his 98th birthday, Truth or Consequences. Game shows have more regulatory rules than news shows to ensure legitimacy. This is Jeopardy! Merv Griffin had been a host of a Goodson Todman show, panelist on another. He feels he's ready to graduate Goodson Todman, wants to do a game show, but he's afraid of the quiz show scandals. So he's driving around talking to his wife. And he says, I want to do this. I don't know how to do this because I don't want them to think it's rigged. And she says to Merv, hey, Merv, just give them the answers. Let them come up with the question. And with that, this is Jeopardy! Started in 1964. John Cameron Swayze was the first television anchorman in 1949. The makers of Camel cigarettes bring the world's latest news events right into your living room. Sit back, light up a Camel, and be an eyewitness to the happenings that made history in the last 24 hours. R.J. Reynolds, the tobacco company, did hand over its news production to NBC, but there was some censorship involved. John Cameron Swayze was the first host. February 16, 1949, it's 7:45 Eastern, 6:45 in Chicago. It was a format that is still used to this day, but here's the censorship. NBC News reports were not allowed to show no smoking signs. A news figure was only to be seen smoking a cigarette. The only guy who was allowed to smoke something other than a cigar, Winston Churchill. And R.J. Reynolds said that he could not do anything about the Korean War. And with our morrow, he was brought down Joe McCarthy. See It Now, 1954, report on Joe McCarthy. And then he would have the other show on April 6, 1954, where he would bring down McCarthy. And we end here, the Kennedy-Nixon debates, 1960 in Chicago, the first debate between Kennedy and Nixon, and that changes TV. That is when looking presidential becomes really important and image becomes everything. I had to, in 1976, listen and watch this for a college thing, and because I was a communications major, tale of two debates. Nixon looks terrible. Kennedy looks great. If you listen to it, Nixon sounds better than Kennedy. The visuals. Newton Minow was the FCC chairman in 1956, rather 1961. Talks about the great wasteland that TV is. And there is the skipper of the SS Minnow, M-I-N-N-O-W. Minnow spells his name M-I-N-O-W. Well, Sherwood Schwartz, who came up with the idea of Gilligan's Island, thought that Minnow was killing TV. And he decided to sink the SS Minnow. And we leave with Star Trek. Star Trek, where no man has ever gone before. Well, remember I said Lucy would become the most powerful woman in TV in the 60s, not because of TV show? After the divorce, she ended up with Desilu Productions, and they did television shows. In 1964, 2 proposals come across her desk, one for Mission Impossible. Board of directors say, do it. They do it. The other for Star Trek. They're not doing it. Too much money. Lucy says, do it. And they do. And it gets rejected. Lucy looks at Star Trek and says, let's do it again. And NBC, well, NBC says, we like that guy Spock. We like that guy Spock. Do it again, Lucy says, featuring Spock. They do. The rest is history. Star Trek gets on the air in 1966. Lucy had at one point Mission Impossible, Mannix, The Lucy Show, That Girl, and Star Trek. The most powerful woman in television was not because she was in front of the camera, but because she was the boss. Anyway, I want to thank you for inviting me. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Anybody have any questions or comments? I know it went a little too long, but feel free to, anything I left out, let me know.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It was wonderful. It was nice having you. And
we will see you again next month.
We will see you next month. Yes, definitely. Definitely.
Yeah,
and thank you everyone who attended. Hope you guys have a great day.
Yeah, anybody have anything to say before I leave? Mary?
No.
Charlene?
No, just thank you so much for the presentation.
Thanks. I hope you enjoyed it, and I tried to make it as Chicago-centric as possible.
Great show. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. And I enjoyed doing this. And I think we're doing Super Bowl talk next month. I'm not sure, but I know I got about 25 of them coming up. So you're getting at the tail end of it. Anyway, thank you for inviting